It was July 28th, 1669. During the hot month, the war was waged abroad. But at home, the children played, the grasshoppers sang, and people tried to stay cool. There was one person, however, who was doing none of that. As the summer continued in its unusual way, Marquis Louvois sat alone writing out a warrant for an arrest. The arrest warrant was different than anything he had done before. This warrant stood apart from the rest of them because there was no name listed and no crime. 2 months later, in August of the same year, the prisoner was apprehended. Louvois sent a letter to Benigne de Villeneuve de Saint-Mars, who served as the governor of Pignerol Prison, informing him that a special prisoner was on his way and giving him instructions concerning this man. The prisoner was not to be treated like the rest. The instructions given to Saint-Mars concerning this prisoner was that he was to be placed inside of a room which had several doors that closed on each other, excluding the very possibility of ever being heard by anyone outside of the cell. In spite of many depictions of this mysterious figure being placed into a mask made of iron, the second instruction for the prisoner was that he was to be placed into a velvet mask, which he was to wear while traveling, where he was most likely to be seen. He was to live in isolation, seeing no one. If he were to be caught speaking to anybody, the instructions were to execute him immediately. The governor received instructions personally. His responsibility concerning this man was to personally see to his needs. Once a day he was to give this man food and water. Saint-Mars was the only person allowed to see him. The letter stated that he shouldn't need much. He was only a valet, after all. On August 24th, 1669, the mystery prisoner arrived at Pignerol and was wearing a mask, and was received by Saint-Mars with a letter stating his name to be Estuche Dauger, which was most assuredly a pseudonym. Saint-Mars had done what he was instructed, and the prisoner was placed into solitary confinement, where he spent the next 34 years of his life. What did this man have to say that royalty was so afraid of even another prisoner hearing? It's safe to say that whatever it was, the governor had to have also known the secret. The prisoner was placed in his care, after all, and he was the only person who knew his identity. What's more, Saint-Mars accompanied this man through 4 different prisons in which he was held. Whatever this man's secret was, the king was very certain he did not want it out. Even though he only wore the mask while traveling, he was still in solitary confinement with the exception of morning and evening prayers, during which time he was kept away from other prisoners. Why were such great lengths sought in dealing with this particular man? What had he done that warranted such treatment? Why was his mask velvet instead of some material that had a rougher texture? If he was so despised, why take the step to give him a velvet mask? According to surviving correspondence between Saint-Mars and his superiors, the entirety of what we know about him was this. He was a valet. He was jailed for what he had seen, what he knew, and what he was employed to do. This doesn't leave us much room for more than speculation. The mask was worn while the prisoner was traveling. And travel he did, though he was not the only one. His jailer was also ordered to travel with him during his journey. Saint-Mars accompanied him through 34 years as the man was imprisoned in 4 different jails during the reign of King Louis XIV. He was imprisoned in Pignerol dungeon from 1669 to 1681, Exiles Ford from 1681 to 1687, the Sainte Marguerite Ford from 1687 to 1698, and Bastille Bertauderie from 1698 to 1703. Who was this man? I'm afraid the possibilities don't clear away any of the questions. Since the correspondence makes the claim that he was a valet, it makes sense to start with various valets. There was a theory proposed once that the prisoner in the mask was not actually real, but rather a creative amalgamation of 2 separate prisoners, namely Mattioli and the imprisoned valet who may have possibly been named Estuche Dauger. It is an interesting thought, although there is no evidence to support such a claim. In 1903, there was a theory presented by Lang, who proposed that Estuche Dauger was actually a pseudonym used in prison for a man known only as Martin, who was a valet for Rue de Marcelly, who was the head of the plot against Louis XIV in 1668. However, a letter later discovered and written by the French foreign minister dismissed the proposition to arrest Martin on the grounds that he was of little to no importance. In 2016, Paul Sonnino, a historian, suggested that Dauger may have been a valet for Cardinal Mazarin's treasurer, Antoine Hercule Picon. Sonnino postulates that Picon may have picked up a valet from Senoly, where the name Dauger is very common. This theory submits that Mazarin led 2 lives. In one of his lives, he was a statesman involved in politics and working for the people. In the other life, he was a loan shark and embezzled a fortune from people he met. One of those people was Henrietta Maria, who was the widow of Charles I. According to the theory, Louis XIV was complicit in this and gave instructions to stonewall Charles II over the return of his parents' possessions. However, when 1669 came, Louis XIV wanted to enlist Charles II in his war efforts against the Dutch. This prompted concerns about whether or not Mazarin's estate, in which Louis XIV was complicit in obtaining, would enter into negotiations and cause scandal. As a result, the valet, who may or may not have existed, was arrested and put under strict scrutiny lest something should be discovered of the whole plot. A theory proposed in 2021 by Josephine Wilkinson postulated that the prisoner was a valet to Henrietta of England, a daughter of King Charles I, and that he had caught her in an indiscretion that compromised her relations between King Louis XIV and Charles II that risked their plans against the Dutch. In July 1669, Louis had a falling out with Henrietta that was public knowledge. Wilkinson, therefore, suggests a link between these events and the prisoner's arrest in Calais later that month. Since none of the theories for a valet seem to fit, let's get a little more specific and look at the name Estuche Dauger itself. During the 1630s, there was a Frenchman by the name of François Dauger du Cavoye who was married to a lady-in-waiting in the court of Queen Anne of Austria, who happened to be the king's mother. The name of his wife was Marie de Sérignan. The couple would have 11 children together. Sadly, only 9 would live into adulthood. 6 boys and 3 girls. The third of these sons was born on August 30th, 1637, and was baptized on February 18th, 1639. This son signed his name, Estuche Dauger du Cavoye. After his father and his brothers were killed in the ongoing battle, Estuche became the head of the household, and perhaps not for the best. Surviving documents from the time show that he was involved in some extremely shady activities, first in 1659 and next in 1665. The first of these was an Easter celebration which occurred in 1659 when Dauger received an invitation from the Duke of Vivionne to attend the event, which would be held at the castle of Roissy-en-Brie. The events which occurred at the castle were far less an Easter celebration and far more of a drunken den of debauchery. One of the drunks at the party came up with the idea of having a good time ganging up on and attacking an elderly man who happened to be the attorney of Cardinal Mazarin. At the end of the Easter celebration, the drunks decided to enact a black mass and to baptize a pig, that they might eat pork on Good Friday. When these events were publicized, and they soon were, everyone involved, from the tall to the small, were given a heated inquiry into these matters. There is, however, no record of what became of Dauger as a consequence of these events. In 1665, another thing of note happened. It was the murder of a young boy near the Château de Saint-Germain-en-Laye. The boy was killed in a drunken brawl that had broken out surrounding the Duc de Foix. The 2 men said that the boy had been drunk and provoked them. However, nobody was charged with this killing. However, the murder did take place close to where King Louis XIV was staying at the time, which meant scandal, and was taken as a personal affront to the king, which resulted in Dauger being forced into resigning his commission. Not long after his mother died, Dauger discovered that she had passed over him in the will. Estuche was left with a small income from the estate, but he barely had enough to meet his food and water requirements. A third event of note in which Dauger participated is historically called the Affair of the Poisons. It occurred from 1677 to 1682. Numerous high-ranking officials had participated in black mass and witchcraft and gone on a murder spree, poisoning their unsuspecting victims. Needless to say, the king was furious. Scandal yet again. However, he was a little less public than one might expect about taking justice, given that his mistress, Madame du Montespan, had been involved in this. It seems that during inquiry the name of their poison supplier came out. The name was Auger. Interesting. It sounds like the name of someone we know, doesn't it? It is certainly a very strong possibility that Dauger had found himself disinherited and living in poverty, and made for himself a new profession selling poisons on the black market to murderous noblemen. The amount of trouble this man had caused the king would certainly have warranted such a harsh imprisonment as our man in the mask received. Well, not so fast. In 1953, historical documents were published which confirmed that Dauger was already in prison at Prison Saint-Lazare in Paris, which was an asylum run by monks in 1668. The prison was well known for being a place where families would put their black sheep to keep them out of public sight. Another nail in the coffin of this story is the question of how Dauger had made some of the objects that had been found on the guilty parties after their deaths. What is being referred to here is a mystery, however, since previous correspondence has been lost. However, he was referred to as a personal valet in the 1680s. Historians have noted that on the arrest warrant for the man in the mask, the name Estuche Dauger was written in an obviously different hand than the rest of the note, as if someone came along and wrote it in later. On June 20th, 1678, Dauger wrote a letter to his sister from the prison full of pity. If Dauger was already in prison 100 miles away when the man in the mask arrived at Pignerol, it seems that this is not our man. We turn our attention to the French general now. In 1890, Louis Gendron, who was a French military historian, happened upon some old dusty letters in which had been written a detailed code. Being very curious about their contents, Gendron passed them on to Etienne Bossary, who worked in the French military's cryptology department. After 3 years of having the letters, he returned some of them to Gendron, along with their uncoded versions. What they possibly suggest is this. At the siege of Cuneo in 1691, there was a French general in charge by the name of Vivian Boulogne. This general received information that enemy troops were shortly arriving from Austria and in great numbers. Fearing imminent annihilation when their enemies arrived, Boulogne ordered a hasty evacuation, and in doing so, left behind valuable military equipment and munitions for his enemies, and also left the wounded to certain death. When Louis heard of this, he was furious. He hastily ordered Boulogne to be conducted to the fortress at Pignerol, where he will be locked in a cell and under guard at night, permitted to walk the battlements during the day with a 330-309. What a 330-309 is, we can only guess. However, some of those guesses are that a 330 is a mask, and that 309 means full stop. Many people believe this solves the case. However, the dates are wrong. The man in the mask would have already been in prison. We must also consider that Boulogne's arrest was not a secret. Newspapers published the event, and it was public knowledge, making any need for secrecy a superfluous gesture. Let's look at a theory involving a diplomat. Count Ercole Antonio Mattioli was an Italian diplomat who had once acted on behalf of Charles IV, Duke of Mantua, in selling him Casale in 1678. It was a fortified tower near the border with France. Charles IV felt that a French presence would not be welcome there, and as a result felt the need for discretion, and he relied on Mattioli for the sale. Mattioli went through with the sale as promised. However, after he received his commission from it, he then leaked all of the details to France's Spanish enemies, who made a bit of their own for the town. Charles was furious, kidnapped Mattioli, and threw him into Pignerol Prison in April of 1679. Two historians studying this case independently, George Agar Ellis and Robert Chambers, came to the same conclusion, that Mattioli was the man in the mask. However, both of them seemed to overlook other documents saying that Mattioli was only held at Pignerol and at Sainte Marguerite, and both of them also seemed to miss the dates. So not this one either. But maybe this is how it happened. On the evening of April 9th, 1649, James Scott was born. An illegitimate child of King Charles II of Scotland and Lucy Walter, he grew into the title of the first Duke of Monmouth. As a Protestant at the time of heated religious war throughout Europe, he led the charge in a rebellion against his Catholic uncle, King James II of England. Ultimately, as we know, the rebellion failed. The Duke knew what this meant, certain death for the leader of the rebellion, and in 1685, in front of his peers, James Scott, Duke of Monmouth, was executed as promised. Or was he? In 1768, a writer by the name of Sainte-Foy appeared, claiming that Monmouth was not, in fact, executed that day. His claim was that another man was executed in Monmouth's place, the reason being that it would be in Louis XIV's interest to assist a fellow Catholic like King James II, who would find himself in a difficult position with a duty to execute his own nephew. Monmouth would have then gone into exile as the prisoner in the mask. This claim is speculatory, but it has no basis in any actual evidence. Or perhaps it's this. Cardinal Richelieu served under King Louis XIII. He came into office with two goals. He wanted to centralize power in France and to oppose the Habsburg dynasty. In the process of pursuing these goals, he ended up deploying troops in order to counter the invading Spanish troops who had designs on northern Italy. However, in doing this, he ended up supporting Protestants against the Pope for a short time. In an effort to consolidate power in France after this, Richelieu ordered all of the fortified castles razed to the ground except for the ones that were absolutely vital in defense in wartime. Of course, this took away all the defenses that noblemen would have had in time of rebellion and upheaval at home. Needless to say, many were angry, and they all hated Richelieu. In an effort to centralize religious power, he ordered the seizure of La Rochelle, which ended up falling. After this point, Protestants were tolerated, though their rights and protections were quickly abolished entirely under his Catholic rule. After this point, he led an army personally to northern Italy to restrain the Spanish troops, which led to him being named Duc de Richelieu on November 26, 1629, and made peer of France. A year after these events, his position was threatened by one of his former patrons by the name of Marie de Médicis, who happened to be the king's mother, claiming that Richelieu had robbed her of her political influence and demanded he be dismissed at once. The king agreed. However, Richelieu was a very persuasive man and turned the king against his own mother in this matter, even though the king detested Richelieu himself. On November 11, 1630, Marie de Médicis once again attempted to gain the dismissal of this horrible man. This time with the help of Gaston Duc d'Orléans, who stood in line for the throne. Once again they had the king's agreement, and once again Richelieu talked him out of it. However, this time it came with a twist. Marie de Médicis was exiled to Compiègne, though she and Gaston still conspired fruitlessly against him. Richelieu kept building power for himself, doing away with anyone who questioned him. He ordered the execution of Henry Duc de Montmorency in 1632 and he had Urbain Grandier burned at the stake in 1634 as a few examples of his pride and cruelty. One day, according to this theory, it occurred to him that when Louis XIII died and Gaston, Duc d'Orléans, took his place as king, Richelieu would find himself in a tight spot wherein his past behavior would catch up to him in the form of an execution. Needless to say, this did not sit well with Richelieu. To counter this event from occurring, he came up with an idea. A wonderful, awful idea. He set to work finding an illegitimate grandson of Henry IV, and when he found him, he brought him to Marie de Médicis to become intimate with her and father and heir to the throne in the king's place, and without his knowledge. According to this theory, the plan worked, and after 14 years of estrangement from her husband, de Médicis was pregnant with his miracle baby, who then took Gaston's place as the next in line for the throne. The child's father was then sent off, probably to America, and everything went swimmingly for Richelieu for several years, until the father returned and demanded hush money. This guy did not know who he was dealing with, apparently. He was immediately thrown into prison, never to be heard from again. If anyone had heard what he had to say, it would have destroyed the legitimacy of the throne. Admittedly, as juicy as the story is, it is almost entirely speculation. Or possibly it happened this way. In 1638, Marie de Médicis was in labor and being attended by a midwife. After several hours, the heir to the throne emerged into the world. But according to one theory, the king-to-be was not alone. A short time behind him came another, a twin. This was unexpected and could cause a problem. How would anyone know which was the eldest boy and thus was to inherit the throne if they looked exactly the same? How could he be sure one wouldn't pretend to be the other and start a war over the throne? Was the firstborn heir to the throne, or was the one thought to have been conceived first the heir? To solve this problem, the twin was separated from the family and grew up on the island of Jersey, known by the name of James de Cloche. He was taken care of, but unknown to the world. What was unforeseen by the family, however, was that in 1669 he would cross paths with Rue de Marcilly, who was planning a conspiracy against King Louis XIV, and saw an opportunity he could not refuse in de Cloche. The king's twin. The plot, however, was discovered. De Marcilly was publicly executed in Paris on June 21, 1669, by breaking on the wheel. During his torture, he was interrogated as to his co-conspirators, and he gave up the name Martin, his valet. According to the theory, Martin would have been de Cloche. A warrant would have been sworn out for him, according to the information, and the king's twin would have been imprisoned under strict supervision. Historically speaking, James de Cloche is somewhat of a mystery. We don't even know if he really existed at all. According to legend, however, he was the illegitimate son of Charles II and was born in 1644 rather than 1638. Is this the correct date? It may be, or it may not be. You never can tell with hazy legends. Some evidence is in favor of the king having a twin. On the night of the twins' birth, something unusual happened. There was a ritual called Te Deum, in which one goes to the church with all of one's friends and relations to give thanks around the Latin song Te Deum. This practice was generally done several days before the birth of the child. However, Louis XIV took the entire court to observe it immediately following the birth. Why would this have occurred? It was virtually unheard of for one to observe this ritual immediately following the birth of the child. It would have been an opportune time, however, for Marie de Marcilly to deliver the second child unnoticed by anyone but the midwife. Another interesting finding that could be of use to us here is the fact that twins ran in the family. They were very common in the Capetian dynasty, as well as the House of Valois, the House of Bourbon, and the House of Orleans. Although interesting, we do have to remember that this is almost entirely speculation. The prisoner in the mask died November 19th, 1703, in Bastille Prison. The inhumation certificate read the pseudonym Marchioli. Interesting that it did not read Estuche Dauger, as did his incarceration letter. He was buried in an unknown place with an unknown name. Birth date unknown. Identity unknown. Crime unknown. If you like this content, go ahead and hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you on the next video.